Imagine a hole cut into solid rock, 15 feet below a castle floor, with no window, no light, and no warmth. The walls are slick with moisture that is frozen into a thin glaze of ice. The air does not move. It sits in the chamber like something dead. And somewhere in that darkness, a human being is breathing, slowly, deliberately, rationally, because breathing too fast will kill them faster than the cold. This was not a nightmare. This was a medieval dungeon in winter. And for thousands of men and women across the castles, fortresses, and monasteries of Europe, this was simply where they lived, for weeks, for months, for years. Some of them died in silence, but a remarkable number of them survived. How they did it reveals something profound about the limits of the human body and the brutal logic of medieval justice. We tend to imagine medieval dungeons as theatrical spaces, torches on the walls, chains hanging from the ceiling, a hooded figure sharpening instruments in the corner. The popular imagination has been shaped by centuries of Gothic literature and Hollywood set design. The reality was far less dramatic and far more horrifying. Most medieval dungeons were not purpose-built torture chambers. They were repurposed storage rooms, cellars, cisterns, and natural cavities beneath fortified structures. The word dungeon itself derives from the Old French donjon, meaning the main tower of a castle, the keep. Over time, the lowest levels of these keeps, the spaces farthest from sunlight and ventilation, became holding areas for prisoners. They were chosen not for their cruelty, but for their security. And a man locked beneath 40 feet of stone had nowhere to go. The architecture did the work of 100 guards. But what made these spaces secure also made them lethal. Castle foundations were built directly into bedrock or packed earth. Stone conducts heat away from the human body roughly 12 times faster than still air. A prisoner sitting on a stone floor in January was not merely cold. They were being slowly drained of the thermal energy that kept their organs functioning. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. Every surface was a radiator working in reverse, pulling warmth out of the body and dispersing it into the mass of the earth. In the northern reaches of medieval Europe, Scotland, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, the mountain fortresses of the Carpathians and the Alps, winter temperatures routinely plunged well below freezing. In particularly severe winters, the kind that struck northern Europe with devastating regularity during the medieval climate anomaly and the onset of the Little Ice Age, temperatures in exposed highland fortresses could reach -30 or even -40 degrees. At those temperatures, exposed skin begins to freeze in under 10 minutes. An unprotected human body can lose consciousness within an hour, and yet, prisoners were placed in these spaces and expected to remain alive, not out of mercy, out of economics. Here is the detail that reframes everything we think we know about medieval imprisonment. Prisoners were, in most cases, an investment. A captured nobleman was worth his weight in ransom. A political rival held leverage as long as he drew breath. Even a common criminal awaiting trial represented a jurisdictional claim, a body that a lord or bishop or sheriff needed to produce before a court. Dead prisoners generated no revenue, no political capital, and no judicial authority. The cold was not the punishment. The cold was the problem, and solving that problem, keeping human beings alive in conditions that should have killed them, became one of the quiet, unglamorous challenges of medieval fortress management. The solutions were rarely humane, but they were pragmatic. To understand how prisoners survived, we must first understand the spaces that tried to kill them. Medieval confinement took several distinct architectural forms, each with its own thermal profile. The oubliette, from the French oublier, to forget, was the most extreme. A vertical shaft, or sometimes no wider than a man's shoulders, dropping into a pit with no exit except the opening above. Oubliettes have been found in castles across France, Scotland, and the Holy Roman Empire. At Warwick Castle in England, a pit beneath the Caesar's Tower descends into a space so narrow that a prisoner could neither sit nor lie down fully. At Leap Castle in Ireland, the oubliette was discovered in the early 20th century to contain the skeletal remains of over 150 individuals. Some had been impaled on wooden spikes at the bottom. These were not spaces designed for survival. They were vertical graves. But most imprisonment did not happen in oubliettes. The more common confinement space was the undercroft, a vaulted cellar beneath the great hall or keep. Undercrofts were originally designed for storing grain, wine, and salted meat. They maintained relatively stable temperatures year-round, typically between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even in winter, because the surrounding earth acted as insulation. For a prisoner, an undercroft was miserable but survivable. The temperature alone would not kill. The damp might. The disease almost certainly would, given enough time. Then there were the tower cells, elevated rooms in the upper stories of keeps and gate towers. These were reserved for high-status prisoners, men and women whose political value demanded conditions marginally better than a hole in the ground. Tower cells had narrow windows, arrow slits usually, that admitted a thread of light and a constant blade of wind. In winter, these cells were paradoxically colder than underground chambers, not because they were exposed to wind chill and had no earth mass to buffer the temperature. The thermal hierarchy of medieval imprisonment was counterintuitive. The deeper you went, the warmer you were. The higher your status, the colder your cell. The human body is a heat engine that operates within a remarkably narrow band. Core temperature must remain between roughly 95 and 104 degrees Fahrenheit for the brain and organs to function. Below 95 degrees, hypothermia begins. Below 82 degrees, the heart loses its rhythm. Below 75 degrees, death is almost certain. When ambient temperature drops, the body initiates a cascade of defensive responses. Blood vessels near the skin constrict, pulling warm blood toward the core and sacrificing the extremities. Shivering begins, involuntary muscular contractions that can increase heat production by up to 5 times the resting rate. But shivering is expensive. It burns through glycogen stores rapidly, which means a shivering prisoner who was not being fed enough was consuming their own muscle tissue to stay warm. The body was cannibalizing itself. At minus 40 degrees, a temperature at which Fahrenheit and Celsius converge at the same number, unprotected human survival is measured in minutes, not hours. But the critical word is unprotected. No medieval prisoner, no matter how despised, was placed naked into an open-air pit at 40 below. The stone walls of a dungeon, the same surfaces that conducted heat away from the body, also blocked wind. And wind is the true killer in extreme cold. A still air environment at minus 10 degrees is survivable for hours. The same temperature with a 20-mile-per-hour wind produces an effective temperature of minus 35, and survival time collapses. The dungeon, for all its horror, was a shelter, a terrible one, but a shelter nonetheless. Medieval imprisonment operated on a principle that would strike modern observers as astonishing. The prisoner, or the prisoner's family, was expected to pay for the privilege of being confined. There was no centralized state budget for incarceration. The jailer, the keeper of the castle's lower chambers, ran his domain as a private enterprise. He charged for food, for bedding, for candles, for the removal of waste, and critically, for warmth. And records from the Tower of London in the 13th and 14th centuries document a tiered system of imprisonment that functioned almost exactly like a medieval inn. A wealthy prisoner could purchase a private chamber with a fireplace, a bed with blankets, meals delivered from the castle kitchen, and even the company of a servant. A prisoner of moderate means might share a chamber with several others and receive a daily bread ration. A prisoner with nothing received nothing. No food, no straw, no covering. They survived on whatever charity reached them through the grate, or they did not survive at all. This economic structure had a direct impact on cold weather survival. The single most important factor in surviving a winter dungeon was not physical toughness or mental fortitude. It was money. A prisoner who could pay for a brazier of coals, a woolen blanket, and a daily meal of pottage had a reasonable chance of enduring even a severe winter. A prisoner who could not pay was dependent on the jailer's willingness to keep them alive, a willingness that was directly proportional to the prisoner's perceived value. At Château de Loche in the Loire Valley, the dungeon accounts from the 15th century record payments for straw, firewood, and coverture, blankets or cloaks, delivered to prisoners during winter months. These were not acts of compassion, they were line items in a ledger. The prisoner was cargo that needed to arrive at trial in presentable condition. For those who could not pay, survival depended on a combination of instinct, ingenuity, and the physics of confined spaces. Straw was the most critical material, and a layer of dry straw between the body and the stone floor could reduce heat loss dramatically. Straw is an effective insulator because it traps pockets of still air within its fibers, and still air is one of the poorest conductors of heat known. Prisoners who received even a thin scattering of straw had a measurable advantage over those who lay on bare stone. The problem was that straw in a dungeon rarely stayed dry. Moisture from breath, from bodily waste, from seeping groundwater, turned insulation into a cold, rotting compress. Prisoners learned, or were told by those who had survived before them, to pile the driest straw beneath their torso and keep it away from the walls where condensation collected. Body heat was the other resource. In communal cells, prisoners huddled together in deliberate physical contact, rotating positions so that no single person was permanently on the outside of the group. This is not speculation. Accounts from medieval chronicles, monastic records, and later prison narratives describe the practice explicitly. At the Conciergerie in Paris, prisoners during the harsh winters of the 14th century organized themselves into sleeping clusters of 6 or 8, with the weakest placed at the center. The geometry was instinctive but effective. A group of 5 human bodies in a confined space can raise the ambient temperature of a small chamber by 10 to 15 degrees, simply through metabolic heat output. Clothing, when it was available, made an enormous difference. A prisoner who entered confinement wearing a woolen tunic, hose, and a cloak had natural insulation equivalent to a modern sleeping bag. Wool retains approximately 80% of its insulating capacity, even when wet, a property that made it the most valuable material in the medieval world for exactly this reason. Prisoners who were stripped before confinement, a common practice for those accused of serious crimes, lost this advantage entirely. The difference between a clothed and unclothed prisoner at near freezing temperatures was often the difference between life and death. Some prisoners improvised. Court records from 14th century England describe a man held in a cellar beneath a sheriff's manor who survived a winter by packing mud from the floor against the walls of his alcove, creating a crude insulating barrier. And another account from a German chronicle describes prisoners in a Rhenish castle who tore strips from their own clothing and stuffed them into cracks in the masonry to block drafts. These were not comfortable solutions. They were acts of biological desperation. The human animal doing what every mammal does when the temperature drops, reducing surface area, blocking air movement, conserving heat. Not all jailers wanted their prisoners to survive. In cases where death was the desired outcome, but execution was politically inconvenient, cold became a weapon of plausible deniability. A prisoner could be placed in an exposed cell, denied fuel, denied covering, and left to the winter. When the body was recovered in spring, the cause of death was providence, not policy. This practice was widespread enough to generate its own vocabulary. In medieval Scots law, the term pit and gallows referred to the right of a lord to imprison and execute, with the pit representing the slow death of confinement. In the Scandinavian sagas, the cold cell, appears repeatedly as a tool of political elimination. King Sverrir of Norway, writing in the late 12th century, described the practice of leaving rivals in unheated tower rooms during the Norwegian winter with a casualness that suggests it was entirely routine. The line between imprisonment and execution by cold was, in many cases, a line drawn by a blanket. Provide one, and the prisoner lives. Withhold it, and nature does what the executioner could not do publicly. The records rarely distinguish between the two outcomes. A prisoner who froze to death in January was simply a prisoner who died in custody. And then the cold left no marks that required explanation. And yet, against all of this, the stone, the damp, the darkness, the cold, the disease, the starvation, a remarkable number of prisoners survived. Some survived for years. Charles, Duke of Orléans, was captured at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 and held in English custody for 25 years. His conditions varied. He spent time in the Tower of London, at Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, and at various other fortifications across England. He endured multiple winters in stone chambers with minimal heating. He survived by writing poetry. Over 2 decades, he produced hundreds of poems in both French and English, many of them meditating explicitly on the cold, the isolation, and the slow erosion of hope. He was ransomed in 1440 and lived until the age of 70. At the opposite end of the social scale, anonymous prisoners in the dungeons of Carlisle Castle Edinburgh Castle and dozens of lesser fortifications across northern England and Scotland survived winters that killed livestock in the fields above them. They survived because the biology of confinement, paradoxically, worked in their favor. A small enclosed space with no ventilation traps metabolic heat. A body consuming even minimal calories produces roughly 100 watts of thermal energy, equivalent to a dim light bulb. In a chamber the size of a closet, that energy accumulates. The air warms, the stone absorbs it and begins, very slowly, to radiate it back. The dungeon becomes a crude accidental incubator. The prisoners who died were overwhelmingly those who were isolated, starved, stripped, or placed in spaces too large for their body heat to make a difference. Survival was not about endurance in any heroic sense. It was about thermodynamics. The medieval dungeon was not designed to be survivable, and it was not designed to be lethal. It was designed to be secure. Everything else, the cold, the damp, the darkness, the slow grinding erosion of health and sanity, was a byproduct of architecture built for a single purpose: keeping a body in a place where it could not leave. That so many prisoners survived conditions that should have killed them speaks less to human resilience in any romantic sense and more to the quiet efficiency of physics. Stone blocks wind, earth stabilizes temperature, straw traps air, bodies generate heat. These are not stories of triumph. They are stories of biology operating at its margins, and of organisms doing what organisms do: persisting, adapting, refusing to stop metabolizing even when every external signal says the game is over. The trade-off is stark. Medieval societies built systems of confinement that were cruel beyond modern comprehension, but they also built them with materials that, almost by accident, gave the confined a narrow corridor of survival. The same stone that drained heat from a prisoner's body also shielded them from the wind that would have killed them in the open. The same earth that kept the cell damp also kept it from reaching the true extremes of the surface temperature. The dungeon was a paradox, a space that was simultaneously trying to kill its occupant and keeping them alive. We have central heating now, insulated walls, weather forecasts that arrive on our phones before the first snowflake falls. We have solved the problem of cold so thoroughly that we have forgotten it was ever a problem at all. But for centuries, warmth was not a setting on a thermostat. It was a resource, scarce, expensive, and unequally distributed. And nowhere was that inequality more visible than in the space beneath a castle,